One morning when I woke up, I was stunned to realize that I had returned to exactly 1 month before my wedding with Aaron Miller. Without wasting a second, I went straight to his family's house to return the engagement gifts, cutting off every connection and treating the marriage as if it had never existed. I knew I was making the right choice, because in my previous life, right after I became pregnant, Aaron and his first love, Bella White, both left for Northwest Ridge. They abandoned me alone in our hometown to serve his parents while I carried our child, holding the baby through sleepless nights of fever and sweat, while the two of them called each other husband and wife in public, going everywhere side by side, hand in hand, like a pair of birds migrating freely through the vast sky that belonged only to them. I stayed behind, living cramped, narrow years in that old house, spinning like a windmill between his parents' medical records and the torn, frayed expense books. Out there, they took summer photos beside long lines of green mountains. In winter, they sent white snow postcards. In every picture, I could see Bella's shoulder leaning against Aaron's, as if it were something completely natural. By the end of my life, when my illness surged violently, they labeled me a burden, a nuisance. My son, Andrew Miller, 35 at the time, rushed back from Northwest Ridge. Before he even entered the room, his resentful voice echoed down the hallway, accusing me of knowing Bella's birthday party was approaching, yet choosing that moment to fall sick, making him miss the chance to celebrate the birthday of the woman he respected more than his own mother. Rage burst inside me, and I spat out a mouthful of blood. My body convulsed, then fell into a cold, silent void. He pushed the door open like an arrow, and behind him, Aaron walked in slowly, dragging his suitcase. Father and son spoke with the same tone. Aaron repeated his worn-out lines, that I shouldn't act like I was dying every time they came back, that whenever they were here, I suddenly became as strong as an ox, that when would I finally learn not to trouble them with every minor inconvenience. Andrew followed up just as harshly, saying that I must think they had plenty of free time in Northwest Ridge, saying I always claimed I was about to die, but still walked around fine when they returned, saying Bella was gentle and sensible, nothing like me. In that suffocating hospital room, I was cornered against the wall, weak and humiliated. After a whole year apart, they didn't even ask about my condition. Instead, they poured a long, endless stream of scolding onto me. They spoke as if I weren't a human being, but some kind of creature dragging them away from Northwest Ridge, away from another woman's celebration, away from the life they believed was worth living. But I was still a person, the former wife of a factory director, a mother who had raised her son with hands cracked from work. Why did I have to be treated like trash? I closed my eyes and let a tear fall. No one noticed it. Andrew kept complaining, saying that every time they spoke, I put on a hurt expression as if they were bullying me, saying that if outsiders saw it, they would think poorly of them. He said Bella was always neat, gentle, composed. I looked at Andrew, standing there cold and stiff like a machine spitting out words, and at Aaron standing in the doorway not even bothering to step closer. And I said directly what they both wanted but didn't dare admit. I told them to stop circling around it. Wasn't it true they both wanted Bella to become Aaron's wife? Didn't they want her to be Andrew's mother? Instantly, in their eyes, I had insulted the holy name of that woman. A new round of scolding began. Smooth, mechanical, practiced like an assembly line. They didn't see the patched fabric on my clothes, didn't see the white bandages on my wrists that hurt to the bone with the slightest movement, didn't see the broken arm lying twisted beside the bed with no one to help, didn't see that the food on the table was cold leftovers from the day before, didn't see that for an entire week I had signed forms alone, cleaned alone, and memorized treatment schedules alone. When they finally finished scolding me, I gathered the last scraps of strength left in my body and lay back down on the bed. There was no trace of expectation left in my eyes. I should have woken up sooner, but I had sunk too deep, sacrificed too much, given an entire lifetime. By the time I understood everything, the path of retreat had already been sealed off by false promises and the couple's photos taken in the white snow. When I was barely 2 months pregnant, Aaron Miller submitted an application to go to Northwest Ridge. I stayed behind alone in my hometown, taking care of his elderly parents until they passed away one after another. I carried my child through seasons of fever, seasons of rain, seasons of hunger. When I finally thought about taking my child out there to look for his father, that was when I learned that in Northwest Ridge, Aaron and Bella White called each other husband and wife, going everywhere as if tied together by an invisible string. I had once made scenes, once broken down, but he never once made a clear choice. Later, I told myself to let it go. If he wanted to be with someone, let him. I still had my son. As long as my child grew up, married, had children of his own, and one day I could hold my grandchild, then maybe my life as a woman wouldn't feel so wasted. But after my son graduated, Aaron called him back to Northwest Ridge for work, and slowly, he moved to their side. Every time he came home to visit, the moment he opened his mouth, he praised Bella and criticized me. Said my clothes were poorly patched, said my hands were dirty, so he didn't want me touching his food, said my eating habits were strange. He never thought about all the years I had saved every penny for him, all the things I denied myself so he could have more. And then, right in the middle of a pain that felt like my body was tearing apart, he delivered the final stab straight into my heart. He said he didn't blame his father for not bringing me to Northwest Ridge, because I was dirty and sloppy, and I embarrassed the family wherever I went, while Bella made his father proud everywhere she appeared. The next day, he left without a word, and for 2 years, we cut off all contact. If it hadn't been for the fact that I needed major surgery and the hospital required a family signature, I might never have called them back. I didn't want to talk anymore. Just told them clearly the time of the operation and said they could leave after signing. Out of habit, Aaron tried to argue again, using the same tired lines, that Bella was only a friend, that I was making people misunderstand. But he suddenly froze when he realized I had just mentioned surgery. In that moment, on the face of a man over 55, whose sharp features had softened with age, appeared an expression of shock, as if he were seeing me as a human being for the first time, not just a shadow in the house. All of that ended with my death in my previous life. And with this morning, when I opened my eyes in my old rented room, hearing the birds outside the window, knowing for certain I was 1 month away from the wedding, I gathered my things neatly, returned the ring and the engagement gifts, and sent a cancellation letter to the Miller family. From now on, there would be no Aaron Miller, no Bella White, no endless hospital hallways, and no more of my own exhausted sighs. I chose my life again from the very first step. I walked slowly down the familiar street, sunlight falling like scattered gold across the pavement. There was no more regret inside me, only a quiet, simple calm. I would find a job. I would heal myself. I would learn to live as someone who owed no one her youth. And if one day I met them again, I would simply smile, letting it pass like the wind across an open field. In this life, the version of me they once trampled on no longer existed. Only the present me remained. Someone who knew exactly who I was, what treatment I deserved, and which direction I needed to walk so I would never return to that old darkness again. Back then, Aaron was the director of the factory. He only needed to stand there without saying a word. His straight posture and cold gaze naturally radiated an authority that made others step aside. The years seemed to leave no trace on his face, unlike mine, worn down by labor until at 50, I looked like a 90-year-old woman. Aaron flipped through my medical file quickly, his thick brows tightening without him even noticing. But how much of that was genuine? I no longer had the strength to measure. Andrew Miller also picked up my medical file, and the tough attitude he had earlier collapsed bit by bit. A flicker of worry appeared in his eyes. "Mom, what did the doctor say?" he asked. I turned my back to them and rasped, "I'm tired. I want to sleep." Tears quietly slipped from the corners of my eyes. The two of them sat for a while, and when they thought I had fallen asleep, they gently stood up. They hadn't even stepped out the door when my son whispered to Aaron, "Dad, Mom has always hated Aunt Bella. It's better if we don't let her know anything about my wedding." Aaron replied immediately, "Of course, I never planned on having her attend the wedding anyway." Andrew lowered his voice. "But what if she finds out I'm marrying Aunt Bella's daughter later?" "What if she makes trouble?" Aaron said. "Then don't let her find out." "Oh, what did you just say?" I shot up from the bed like a spring, glaring straight at both of them. Who are you marrying? Bella White's daughter, isn't it? Andrew spoke before Aaron could. Yes, our wedding is next month. Dad and I already discussed it. We'll have the ceremony in Northwest Ridge. I do not agree. My voice rose to a near scream. I absolutely do not agree to you marrying the daughter of your father's mistress. My son burst into anger, his eyes turning sharp and cold in a way I had never seen. Mom, this is an era of free marriage. You don't get to interfere in my choices. And let me remind you again, Aunt Bella and Dad are just pure, sincere friends, not dirty the way you think. If you keep talking like that, don't expect me to take care of you when you're old. Aaron stood there silently, not stopping him. It was obvious he thought the same. A wave of rage crushed my chest. I couldn't breathe. Blood gushed from my mouth as my body curled in agony, rolling on the bed. Father and son turned pale and shouted for the doctor, but before anyone arrived, I had already taken my last breath. They stood there stunned for a long time. I once believed that my death might shake even a shred of conscience in them. But what they thought about was only that the wedding would have to be postponed. If that's not inhuman, then what is? I refused to accept it. If there were another life, I would rather never marry Aaron Miller, rather never live that kind of life. I would never again endure so foolishly. I would repay every debt. Heaven must have heard me. I opened my eyes one early morning in my old rented room. In the mirror I saw myself at 20, full cheeks, fair skin, naturally rosy lips. Not a breathtaking beauty at first glance, but everyone in the neighborhood used to say it was the face of good fortune. I held my breath for several seconds before realizing I had come back. It was May 9th, 1980, exactly 1 month before the wedding. I rushed out of the yard and ran straight to the factory to find Mr. Lee, asking to withdraw the marriage approval form Aaron had just submitted. Mr. Lee looked at me in surprise. But Aaron just reported that you two are getting married next month. Why are you pulling the documents? Did he fail some test of yours? I used the excuse that my grandmother back home said the chosen date wasn't good and that I needed to review it. My parents, once steel mill workers, had died in an accident. My only living relative was my grandmother in the countryside. Hearing that, Mr. Lee didn't push further. He only reminded me that marriage was an important matter and I should discuss it carefully before deciding. The moment I stepped out of his office, I tore the approval paper to pieces and threw it into the ditch behind the factory. The scraps drifted away with the water while I crossed the road to the clinic across the street to find Aunt Grace. She was the one who last time told me, "Next month, bring your child and I'll take you up to the medical research facility in the Highlands." I walked in and said, "I agree, Aunt Grace." She had just finished packing the medicine and lit up at seeing me, but then froze. "But aren't you marrying Aaron next month? How can you go?" "I'm not getting married anymore. I canceled it." She gasped. "What happened?" I looked straight at her, my voice firm as a nail being driven in. "Aaron Miller is not a good man. I don't need him." Aunt Grace stared at me for a long moment. When she saw I wasn't joking, she nodded. "If you don't need him, then so be it. You deserve someone better. I'll talk to the higher-ups and arrange for you to come with me." I let out a quiet breath. Aunt Grace had been my mother's closest friend, someone who spent her whole life devoted to medicine but ended up delayed by family circumstances. She loved me like her own child. The last time she heard I was planning to marry Aaron Miller, she warned me that women always suffered disadvantages in life, and at the very least, I should master a skill before talking about marriage. Only then could I stand firm against whatever storms came my way. This time, I wasn't just learning a skill to protect myself. I was learning to live a different life. A life called Lisa, one I chose myself. But back then, I had been stubborn and refused to listen. I'd even gotten upset and walked out, thinking Aunt Grace would give up on me. I never expected that she hadn't blamed me at all and had quietly saved a precious training slot just for me. Looking at her now, gratitude filled my chest. "I won't disappoint you," I said. After that, I left the clinic and went back to my workplace. I worked as the clerk at the factory, a position arranged for me after my parents died. The job wasn't too heavy, and the salary was enough to live on. But in my previous life, Less than 2 months after marrying Aaron, I became pregnant. He claimed I tired easily and forced me to quit, telling me to rest at home. Then he turned around and applied to go to Northwest Ridge, abandoning me to give birth alone in the South, taking care of myself while also serving his parents under their harsh and bitter demands. If I survived to the end, it must have been because my ancestors had mercy on me. At 5 p.m., when my shift ended, I took my meat voucher to the market and bought a fish, 2 packs of tofu, a few pounds of ribs, and a bundle of greens. I planned to make fish soup with white tofu and green onions and salt and pepper ribs to nourish myself. But just as I stepped into the courtyard of the housing block, I immediately ran into Aaron's parents, heading somewhere together. My heart sank. Of all the luck. Back then, because our engagement had already been announced, the leadership arranged for Aaron and me to live in the same housing compound, different rooms, but close enough for convenience. Convenient for whom was obvious. The moment I moved in, he brought his parents from their hometown to live with him. Bookmark, go back. Lisa, Aaron is working late tonight, he would say, handing me groceries. He doesn't have time to take care of his parents. Make a meal for them, okay? They're easygoing. Easygoing? As long as there was meat, they were easy. Sure enough, every time they saw me carrying food, their eyes glued themselves to the bag. If there was meat, they grinned. If not, they mocked and prodded, saying that I was stingy even before marriage, saying that once I married in, they'd probably have to beg for food on the streets. The louder they got, the more neighbors peeked out to watch. In my previous life, I'd been afraid of embarrassment. I told myself they were my future in-laws, so I endured. I didn't even dare keep my own meat vouchers. Every day, I bought meat to cook for them. I cooked. They ate. By the time I brought the dishes out, the meat plates were already spotless. No broth, no fat left behind. When they finished, they just dusted their hands, tossed their chopsticks aside, and left me to clean everything. When I gave birth, my coworkers gifted me a few chickens. Aaron's mother cooked them, and she and her husband ate every last bit, leaving me half a bowl of broth and 2 bony chicken feet. The moment I so much as sighed, she screamed loud enough to shake the sky, calling the neighbors over as witnesses because she knew I was timid and hated noise. But this life was different. The moment they saw the fish and ribs in my bag, their eyes lit up. Aaron's mother even reached out to grab it, her voice suddenly syrupy. "Let me see what you bought. I'll cook it for you." I pulled the bag tight against my chest and stepped back 3 paces. "No need, ma'am." Her face darkened instantly, then switched tone again just as fast. "Then hurry and cook. Aaron's parents are starving. When you're done, call us. We'll be waiting in our room." I cut her off sharply. "This is food I bought with my own voucher. I'm cooking it for myself. There won't be any for the 2 of you. If you want to eat, buy your own." They both froze. After a beat, Mr. Miller narrowed his eyes, a flash of hostility appearing. Mrs. Miller immediately launched into her old performance, screaming across the courtyard, "Oh my heavens, the daughter-in-law isn't even married yet and she's already mistreating her mother-in-law. How am I supposed to live in the future?" Windows up and down the block slammed open. In my previous life, I had stayed silent and let them say whatever they wanted. And because of that, I was branded unfilial. Eventually, no one wanted to associate with me. But this time, I raised my voice, clear and sharp. "You order me around like your servant, but have I married your son yet? Or are the 2 of you so old and crippled that you can't even prepare one meal yourselves?" A few murmurs rose from the crowd. Someone even chimed in, "They're not even married yet, and you're already making her serve you. After the wedding, are you planning to make her carry your chamber pots too? And that meat voucher is hers. Why should she share?" Judgmental stares gathered on Aaron's parents, but their faces were thick, and what truly held their attention were the ribs and the fish in my hands. Through clenched teeth, Mrs. Miller hissed, "You used my son's money to buy those vouchers. Why shouldn't I get a share? Hand them over." And before I could react, she suddenly lunged to grab my bag. I tilted my body away, and she missed, crashing onto the ground and rolling as she wailed, "Oh heavens, my arm! You broke my arm." Mr. Miller rushed over, supposedly to help his wife, but his hand shot straight for the handle of my bag. It was so blatant, it was almost laughable. I reached out, grabbed the bamboo drying rod beside me, and brought it down clean and sharp onto the back of his hand. He yanked it away with a grunt, the skin already turning red. I straightened my spine, my voice cold as well water. Touch my things again, and I'll call the neighborhood coordinator and the factory guards to make this clear. The vouchers are mine, given to each worker individually. If someone wants to eat, they can earn their own and buy their own food. Mrs. Miller, who had been lying on the ground screaming, abruptly went quiet. She glanced around, noticing that the neighbors' eyes were no longer sympathetic. She quickly changed her tone. "Sweetheart, I only wanted to cook for you." I looked straight at her. "I've already canceled my engagement with Aaron Miller. From now on, please stop attaching my name to anything involving the two of you." Mr. Miller clenched his teeth. "My son won't let this go." I smiled. "Good. I'd love for him to come explain in front of the neighborhood committee why his fiancé, who isn't even married yet, was forced to feed his entire family." A door creaked open. The accountant living at the front of the building said calmly, "Lisa's right. Everyone should eat from what they bought. Don't make a scene." Several voices murmured in agreement. Mr. and Mrs. Miller's faces darkened as they stepped back silently. I walked past them with my bag without giving either of them a glance. On the stairway, the late afternoon sun poured down, warm, dry, like a fresh chalk line drawn between us. In this life, I was no longer a daughter-in-law standing at someone else's doorway, no longer a shadow meant to cook and apologize. I was Lisa, the woman who used her own vouchers, cooked her own meals, signed her own life. And anyone who reached for my bag would get a clean crack of bamboo to remind them to step back. That sharp snap of bamboo echoed across the courtyard, making the entire row of houses hold their breath. No one had expected someone as slim as me to strike so cleanly and decisively, let alone dare hit the hand of her supposed future father-in-law. Mr. Miller held his swollen hand, eyes bloodshot, lunging at me several times only to stop short each time when he saw the bamboo still in my grip. He shoved his wife forward as a shield. Mrs. Miller bared her teeth and hissed each word. "Lisa, whether you like it or not, you will cook tonight's meal for us. If you don't, I'll tell Aaron to break off the engagement. Your reputation will be ruined. No one will want you." I laughed coldly. "No need. When he gets back, I'll break it myself." Realizing I wasn't bluffing, both of them flinched. 2 weeks ago, I had treated them as carefully as if they were ancestral tablets. But now I stood tall, my eyes sharp as blades. They were shaken, unable to understand why I had suddenly changed. But they understood one thing clearly. I had a stable job and good pay. A daughter-in-law like that, rare as gold in a rationed world, was not someone they could afford to lose. So despite their anger, they had no choice but to swallow it. They would wait until after the wedding to deal with me. I saw right through them. Ignoring their faces, I carried my bag inside, set the pan on the stove, fried the ribs with salt and pepper, and simmered the fish soup with tofu. Just as I set the plate of ribs on the table, Aaron Miller wandered in, almost as if he had sniffed out the food. At only 22, with good work performance, he had just been promoted from a regular worker to team leader. Yet his face was stormy, dark as thunderclouds. Back then, I thought he was stressed about the new position. I didn't know until later that it was because of Bella White, his former lover who had become someone's wife, had a child and had come back. She'd even come to the factory to find him. No one knew what they said to each other. Only that when she left, someone saw Aaron acting like a madman, racing to find Mr. Lee. When a coworker told him Mr. Lee was away on business, he barged into the office anyway, ransacked the desk drawers searching for something, and when he didn't find it, slammed his fist into the wall. When I heard the story back then, I was still naive. I assumed the organization hadn't arranged a proper position for Bella. So that was why he was angry. Who would have expected that Bella herself had applied to return and live here long-term? The moment he heard she wanted to stay, he immediately lost all desire to marry me. In my previous life, because Mr. Lee had already submitted the marriage leave paperwork to the higher-ups before going on his business trip, Aaron missed his chance to pull it back. When he returned, his face was as heavy as stone, acting as if I had forced him into the marriage. In this life, he lunged just as desperately to retrieve the approval slip, and cancel everything. But this time I had already moved first and granted his wish. He washed his face at the well outside, then walked into my room out of habit. Ever since I moved here, he'd come by after work to eat before going home. I brought the soup out, and he glanced at it, said nothing, and went straight to the kitchen to scoop rice. I clearly saw him take only one bowl for himself. Thinking about it now, I felt nauseated. How blind had I been in my previous life to ever fall for that selfish, narrow-hearted man? He had just sat down when I flicked the chopsticks out of his hand. My voice was cold as deep well water. "You're not eating here today. There's no portion for you." His face darkened, but before he could flare up, I said clearly, "I already retrieved the marriage leave approval. We're not getting married." He jerked his head up, and a flash of relief lit his eyes faster than he could hide it. But almost immediately he smoothed on his affectionate mask, lowering his voice. "Lisa, what are you saying? Did I not do well enough?" But I didn't want to hear it. I cut him off. "We're not compatible. I've already agreed to go with Aunt Grace next month to the Highlands for medical research. I might not come back for a year." I calmly scooped rice, took ribs and fish, and filled my bowl, my meat vouchers, my food, not a single bite for him. Aaron froze like a rusty hinge, but the trace of joy still flickered at the corners of his eyes, exposing his true heart. Even now, he dared to sweet-talk. "A year isn't that long. I'll wait for you." I shrugged. "No need. Ending things early makes everything lighter." For the past 2 years, we had met through a co-worker's introduction. I thought he was sincere, bringing an umbrella in the rain, medicine when I was sick, extra food vouchers during holidays, sometimes even giving me clothes. Because of those gestures, I had loved him. But it turned out he chose me, only because Bella had gotten married. Once he had me, his true coldness leaked through, bit by bit. Many times in my previous life, I had imagined telling him, "Fine, just wait then," and watching his glowing face crumple like wet paper. But in this life, I wanted a different show entirely. I wouldn't stand in the way of him and Bella White anymore. Happiness built on betrayal had never been real anyway. He opened his mouth to explain, but before he could speak, his parents appeared in the doorway holding bowls and chopsticks. I pushed the door open and waved my hand. "Get out. I need to meet Aunt Grace." Before they could snoop around my room, I swept all the food into the cabinet, including the chopsticks in Aaron's hand, then locked it with a loud click. He stared like he was seeing a ghost. I lifted my chin toward him and his parents. "Planning to fight me over my own dinner too? Even if we're breaking up, you don't have to be this heartless." He growled through his teeth. "I do," I replied evenly. "Get out. Don't bring your bad luck into my room." "Lisa," he snapped, eyes reddening. "Watch your mouth. What did my parents ever do for you to insult them?" In my previous life, the moment he barked my full name like that, I shrank and swallowed every word. But in this life, I lifted my head, looked straight into his eyes, and said, "If you don't get out, I'll grab that broom and sweep you out myself." My fingers flicked toward the broom leaning against the wall near the doorway. The afternoon sun slanted across us like a new boundary line, and I stepped. Truly stepped, for the first time onto the ground that belonged to me. My words hadn't even faded when Mr. and Mrs. Miller appeared at my doorway again. Mrs. Miller snatched up the broom at the corner and shrieked, charging at me, "You brat! How dare you disrespect my son? Let me show you how I smack that mouth of yours." She raised the broom high, about to strike, but Aaron stepped forward and grabbed it midair. His eyes flashed coldly across me as he dragged his parents out to the porch with a rough yank, then slammed the door shut. Denied her chance to hit me, Mrs. Miller switched to her sharpest weapon, her mouth. Her vinegar-soaked words poured out non-stop, burning through the hallway until it was hard to breathe. The noise irritated Aaron, and for the first time in my life, I heard him raise his voice at his mother. "Stay within bounds. If you keep this up, I'll send you back to the countryside. And don't even think about showing up at the factory again to cause trouble." In my previous life, before he left for Northwest Ridge, every time his mother cornered me until I broke, he only said one word, "endure," and promised things would calm down once his parents returned home. The more I endured, the deeper I sank. When I became pregnant, he applied for a transfer to Northwest Ridge. I begged to go with him. He coaxed me, saying it was freezing there, and I was pregnant, and the climate wouldn't suit me. He told me to stay home and wait for him to return to bring me over. I waited through one season after another, 35 long years, and that promise never came true. In the end, I had to follow his parents back to their hometown alone and raise my child there. This time, seeing her son truly angry, Mrs. Miller finally shut up, though when she turned away, she still shot me a look sharp as a needle. I spat on the cold floor. Her face drained of color, and she raised her claw-like hand to scratch, but before she could strike, Aaron yanked her back. His voice was curt. "From today on, she and I are done. She's no longer my fiancé. Don't bother her again." The Millers froze for a moment, but before they could respond, he blurted out that he'd gotten promoted. Instantly, their eyes lit up. Promoted? To what? Team leader of the workshop. "Oh, our ancestors have blessed us." Mrs. Miller lifted her chin toward me, her tone icy. "Good thing you canceled the engagement. A woman who can't respect her elders doesn't deserve to be our daughter-in-law. My son will find someone better." Aaron said nothing more and walked away. After the door shut, I leisurely finished setting up my meal. The salt and pepper ribs were perfectly crisp, and the fish tofu soup was light and sweet. Eating alone warmed my stomach and soothed my mind far more than feeding those ungrateful people ever had. That night, I slept the deepest sleep I'd had in years. The next morning, news of my broken engagement had spread through the whole housing block, courtesy of Mrs. Miller herself. She told everyone I was unfilial and rude, unworthy of becoming their daughter-in-law. But anyone with sense only needed one look to know the real problem. The more she talked, the more unreasonable she sounded. Neighbors finally snapped and talked back. How could one petty, sour mouth win against an entire building? She argued until her face flushed and ears burned, and still lost. Enraged, she even swung her hands at a few people. But everyone who lived in these assigned company units had backing. By the time Aaron heard what happened and rushed over, Mrs. Miller had already scratched up the faces of two older women, both mothers of men with positions higher than Aaron's. He dragged them to the hospital, bowing his head and begging them not to report it to their sons. They only smirked and immediately made the call. The moment their sons arrived and saw their mothers covered in blood, they exploded. Right there in the hospital waiting room, they tore into Aaron with a fury that shook the walls. He bent over like a scolded child, unable to utter a single word. The consequences were immediate. A demotion notice landed on the desk. Aaron was sent back to being a machine operator. For the next few years, climbing up again would be nearly impossible. Back from the hospital, he vented his anger on his parents, scolding them like children. But the two of them still stubbornly insisted everything they'd done was for his own good. And then tried to shove all the blame onto me to protect his reputation. When it reached that point, Aaron tried to force his parents to return to their hometown. They refused and even smashed pots and pans. Furious, he grabbed his coat and disappeared for several days. Having lived their whole lives as the tyrants of their little village, one shout enough to shut down the neighborhood. The Millers thought they could do the same here. Instead, the entire housing block slammed doors in their faces. Wherever they knocked, people threatened to call the police. Panicking, they remembered me. The moment I saw them lurking near my doorway, I lifted the broom upright, told them to take one more step if they dared. Mr. Miller, having once tasted my bamboo stick, shrank back instantly and dragged his wife away. Half a month later, Aaron finally appeared again. Walking beside him were Bella White and her 3-year-old daughter, Lily, hugging a stuffed bear and swaying as she walked. Maybe after that time, Aaron disappeared from home. The Millers finally learned fear. When he told them he wanted to marry Bella White, they went silent. I understood perfectly. It wasn't that they didn't dare. It was that they were waiting. Once Bella stepped into their door, then they would slowly show their true claws. The only difference this time was that with Aaron supporting her, they wouldn't dare go as far as they had with me. Mrs. Liu at the front of the housing block leaned toward my ear. "That fox of a woman, other than having a big chest, what else does she have? I don't understand what part of her Comrade Miller likes." I gave a thin smile. Maybe that's the only thing she has left to attract him. Mrs. Liu insisted that Bella had meddled and broken up my relationship, refusing to believe me when I said it was my decision to let go. Every day, Bella brought her daughter over to curry favor with Aaron's parents, and the Millers rolled up their sleeves, pretending to be gentle, helpful elders. One afternoon, as the market thinned out, Bella and I crossed paths. I cursed my luck silently. She, however, walked straight toward me, carrying the same high and mighty aura she had in my previous life. Back then, she once secretly brought me an album of photos she and Aaron took in Northwest Ridge, starting from the day he was transferred there. Page after page showed the places they'd visited together, shoulder to shoulder like husband and wife. As I flipped through them, I felt each page slicing another wound across my heart. On the last page, in his shaky handwriting, Aaron had written, "In this lifetime, the person I love most is you." That day, I was so devastated I vomited blood and collapsed. But in this life, I simply straightened my collar and stood right there in the middle of the market aisle, looking at her as calmly as if watching a strange wind drift past the eaves. "Your blood is yours to keep. Your knife is yours to sheath," I thought. As for me, I've stepped into a life of my own choosing. There's no place left in it for them to draw even a single drop more. In the past, once she achieved her goal, Bella would put away the album and throw a few venomous lines at me before walking off, leaving me lying in the courtyard like a chicken with its throat cut, gasping in the winter wind. If a neighbor hadn't seen me that night, I might have frozen to death on those cold concrete steps. But now, in front of me stood Bella White in a soft pink silk dress, her hands elegant but sharper than before. She spoke first. "I heard you and Aaron Miller broke off the engagement, and that you initiated it. If that's the case, it has nothing to do with me. Please don't make up stories that damage my reputation or Aaron's." I snorted, spat on the ground, and said flatly, "Aaron Miller? Men with 2 legs are like mushrooms. You grab a handful anywhere. As for him, I consider myself unlucky to have met him. In my eyes, he's not worth more than a pile of trash. Only you would treat him like a treasure." Right then, Aaron returned. Bella instantly pressed her lips together, her eyes turning red as if ready to slap me. She shouted, "Don't you dare talk about Aaron like that." I stepped half a pace to the side, fully intending to let her fall on her face, but before she could lunge forward, Aaron grabbed her tightly. He swung his head toward me, face dark as soot, and without asking a single question, he spit out his words through clenched teeth. "In your eyes, I'm not even worth a pile of trash? Fine, Lisa. I want to see who would ever marry a vicious woman like you after breaking up with me." I rolled my eyes, my tone flat as ash. "No matter how bad things get, I'll never pick up someone else's leftovers and let him become stepfather to another woman's child." He nearly exploded. His arm twitched, about to swing, but Mrs. Liu rushed forward, pulling me behind her and snapping at him. "Wrong, am I? If you were such a great catch, would you really be marrying a woman who already had a husband and now comes with a child? Or is it that you have issues of your own? Can't father a child, so you're picking up what others threw away? That little girl got lucky. If she hadn't been smart early, you and your parents would have worked her mother to death." Bella's name was like a blade in Mrs. Liu's mouth, and each cut landed on Aaron until he could no longer speak. Red-faced and furious, he could only drag Bella away. I went straight to the administration office to find Mr. Lee. Since Bella had just accused me of damaging her and Aaron's reputation, I decided to take advantage of the moment and clarify everything properly. I repeated the entire story, adding a few more seasonings, telling him that before the engagement with me was officially canceled, the 2 of them had already been sneaking around. At that time, disciplinary rules regarding such affairs were as strict as stretched wires. And as expected, the next morning the upper-level committee sent 3 officers to the Miller's residence for inspection. The moment they pushed open the courtyard gate, the 3 men froze in shock. My God, unbelievable. Mr. and Mrs. Miller were walking outside with little Lee, Bella's daughter, while Aaron was just about to leave for work. Inside, Bella was standing at the stove in a tight dress. He simply couldn't control himself. Right there in the kitchen, at dawn, they were already tangled together doing something filthy. The 3 officers turned pale, spun around, and walked straight out. The two of them were still wrapped around each other. And by the time they remembered someone had just been standing at the door, it was already too late. Aaron Miller and Bella scrambled to pull on their clothes and ran after the officers to explain. But no matter what he said, the truth remained. Less than 2 weeks after breaking his engagement with me, he had already gone to bed with another woman. How unlucky could a story get? The factory concluded immediately that Aaron Miller had serious moral misconduct. All previous privileges were revoked, and he was reassigned to janitorial work, sweeping floors. When his parents heard, they went berserk. Mrs. Miller slapped Bella across the face, calling her a fox and throwing her out. Bella's job had not yet been arranged, and she didn't want to return to the dormitory, so Aaron had to take money out of his own pocket to rent her a room. The Millers knew where she was staying, and they certainly didn't treat her like someone their son loved. Each of them grabbed a broom and went to her room to beat her half to death. When Aaron arrived, he found Bella sprawled on the floor, her face swollen and bruised purple. He lost his mind, screamed at his parents through the night, shoved them into a vehicle, and sent them back to their hometown, declaring coldly that their relationship was over. But not long after, he brought Bella and Lily back to the factory housing. After being placed under internal investigation, he seemed to give up completely. No marriage ceremonies, no registration, they simply moved in together. He worked at the factory, she cooked. On the surface they looked calm, but the moment the house warmed up, it exploded, almost ending in a murder. From the very first moment I saw Bella White again, when her phoenix eyes sliced like knives, I knew she was not the type to settle down. And I was right. That day, Aaron went to the workshop, and she, unable to change her nature, brought a strange man into their home. Before long, sounds burst from the room that turned faces red. "Baby, tell me who's better, Aaron or me?" "Of course you are." "Really?" "Obviously, Aaron's boring. If he didn't have a little money, I would have dumped him long ago." Bella teased him again, complaining that Aaron forgot his documents and came back, only to stand at the doorway hearing every word. Rage consumed him. He grabbed a kitchen knife and stormed into the bedroom. The two naked bodies rolled off the bed in panic. Seeing the danger, Bella threw all the blame onto the man. Aaron shoved her aside, swung the knife down toward the man's vital parts. A scream tore the air, and the man collapsed unconscious. Aaron turned, inching toward Bella, the blade still trembling in his hand. Just then, 3 officers burst in and tackled him. He was handcuffed and taken to the station for attempted assault. Worse, the man caught with Bella was someone with influence. During the investigation period, Aaron was beaten daily by the other detainees. On the day of the trial, he didn't even make it to the platform. He collapsed completely. His parents rushed over, received his body, and by the time they left the morgue, their hair had turned white, and their backs bent like broken sticks. Bella realized she couldn't stay. She took her daughter and boarded a train out of the city. That afternoon, I spent my time gathering the quiet around me, brewing a pot of tea, and sitting by the window as the sunlight drifted across the sill. Old scripts collapsed on their own without me lifting a finger. In this life, I no longer needed to prove anything with my own blood. All I had to do was walk straight and walk alone. That night, the train carrying Bella and her daughter left the city and seemed to vanish into the folds of hills and tunnels. Both of them disappeared without a trace. No one knew where they drifted. Rumors rose like smoke but blew away just as quickly, leaving only a cold emptiness in the memories of those who had witnessed that hurried farewell under the dim station lights. 3 years later, a patrol team near the border found the body of a woman buried in a patch of tall reeds. Her papers were destroyed, but the marks on her body told the rest of the story. She had been trafficked and brutalized along the way. It was Bella White. As for little Lily, there was no trace, no record, only a file opened and closed, with the final note reading, "Missing," like a single final period. Quiet and still between the mold-scented pages, the story settled into silence. From that moment on, I folded away all the old chapters of my life and poured my entire mind into following Aunt Grace up to the Highlands to study traditional medicine. Days were spent walking from village to village. Nights were for oil lamps, learning each herb by sight, sketching every pulse chart by hand. My early morning and late-night footsteps polished the wooden threshold of the small clinic until it gleamed. I no longer looked back toward the factory housing block, nor did I let my heart tremble because of any name that belonged to yesterday. Many years later, I returned to the city and took over a hospital in the middle of an expansion phase. I built new departments, trained new generations, and ran funds to support poor patients. Work rose and fell like the tide, finishing a surgery only to walk into a case review, leaving a conference only to head back to the patient ward. I had no strength left for anything outside of this. Each day passed measured, not by hours, but by the beating hearts of the sick and the faint scent of disinfectant clinging to my white coat. When the plaque reading, Chief of Medicine, was finally hung on the dark wooden door, I stood there in silence for a moment, then smiled. My life had turned a new page. No more dark corridors, no more echoes of fights from the past, only a straight path ahead, of work, of duty, and of a heart that had learned to beat steadily on its own through every upheaval.